recall Norman Cousins' skeptical reference to television as a billion-dollar blunder, and the New York Times' fear that the technology stood to transform America's garrulous tavern-goers into a horde of mutes. These concerns, now a decade old, are confirmed in The Beatniks, episode 415. Ambient televisions make social establishments less social. Here, the troublemaker isn't a tavern set, though, and it's not the unsavory element of society who is attracted to it. A soft-spoken fellow whose only vice, so far as we know, is being a sports fan, sits at the corner stool of a diner bar watching a TV baseball game when Helen and Chuck, already hardened hold-up artists despite only being in their teens, drown it out with jukebox swing. A war of hostile gestures ensues as Helen turns off the television in turn.
If you want to watch TV, go home,
She says.
Ain't no living room.
The New York Times is only half right. The screen is actually capturing the attention of the silent blue-collar worker. The actor who plays the sports fan has no lines, and attracting the protests of the hardened criminal. This attests to the fact that the appliance has settled in with American households, with TV ownership rates hovering at around 90%. Resistance to them is now the purview of the antisocial element, and indeed Helen's protest seems to be founded in the resentful presumption that the sports fan and the older generation he represents have a home to go to and a television to watch once they get there. We don't see much of the Beatniks' home life, but it seems safe to assume they have none to speak of, or that such home life as does exist is unstable, fraught with trouble. Beatniks goes on to follow a formula familiar to anyone who's seen My Dream Is Yours. A big-name producer discovers a young, good-looking, talented singer, and complications ensue. The difference, and it's a big one, is that instead of being a dedicated and wholesome war widow, our dewy-eyed crooner, Eddie, is an ambivalent member of Helen and Chuck's lawless gang and stands the risk of becoming an irredeemable beatnik. The turmoil his sudden fame introduces into his life, consequently, is far more toxic than was the case with Martha Dixon, as his compatriots, a deranged malcontent named Moon in particular, trashed their hotel room and threatened violence against the terrified staff. This all spirals inevitably down into a post-Shakespearean tragic climax. Unable to disguise his gang's misdeeds or adequately distance himself from them, Eddie winds up snared in the dragnet laid out for them. The potential of his young love and fledgling career tragically cut short in the way typical of juvenile delinquency films. One senses in Eddie's alignment with these hooligans an unresolved childhood affiliation, that they were friends in pre-adolescence but had different ways of experiencing the sexual and spiritual awakening of puberty. Otherwise, the question of why he spends time with them is a mysterious one. He's constantly at odds with them, and they, Moon in particular, repeatedly question his allegiance, using a tactic social groups that reward their members in more conventional ways rarely need to resort to. And yet, in the film's opening, the gang seems to have located some sort of hectic equilibrium. It's true that Eddie and his belle-to-be are visibly uneasy with the emergent violent tendencies of their peers, but their relationship has evolved into a standoff, a sort of Cold War writ small, in which they will eventually manage to reform Moon and the others' behavior, or whether the gang's attempts to shame them for their loyalty and go their own way. Eddie's success upsets this precarious balance. Though it's certainly possible the gang was destined to attract the law's attention in any case, their track is just less likely to lead to Eddie and his girlfriend ultimately turning their backs on the gang, the misdeeds they've committed up to then going unsolved into posterity, while Moon and his contingent gradually transitioned into career criminality. Alas, the record company's largesse sends the more feral gang members into such an exuberant, self-indulgent frenzy that the hand of society is forced on them. Once again, fame, particularly the distinct sort of notoriety modern technological media provide, ultimately undoes its very beneficiaries. In questioning Eddie's loyalty and the motives of his new benefactors, Moon levels critiques of the establishment and the preceding generation that would be well met among many aspiring young students of Marxist thought. Moon insinuates that the label is only using Eddie, and that once they're done with him, they'll throw him away. Here, Beatniks' political agenda becomes most conspicuous, mainly because Moon, so obviously and obnoxiously the movie's heel, is making a perfectly fair point. True, Eddie's producer strikes up a paternal and kindly relationship with Eddie early on. It goes without saying, though, that should the popularity of Eddie's musical act wane, the company will have no further use for him. The relationship between talent and management is founded on financial advantage, and at best presents a mere pretense of familial fealty. Thus, one of the purposes of Beatniks and the juvenile delinquency movie generally is to protect the established order of the marketplace from legitimate critiques by having criminals and psychopaths be the ones who mount them. Defending the free world from the dangers of communist ideology is an ongoing theme today, and it's taking on more and more urgency and becoming more extreme. This is partly because the cost of this free market crusade is proving quite high. The defense budget still consumes most discretionary government spending in the United States, even though the country has technically been at peace since 1945, and partly because the message of the free market has quite a bit of incoherence built into it. Though it's true that the Soviet Union exerts a level of control over its citizens that makes most Westerners uncomfortable, and the Soviet Union is no stranger to cruelty, these characteristics are scarcely unique to collectivist ideology. The Nazis were able to enact their own pogrom of intense savagery under a brand of governance that countenanced an expansive private sector. The Nazi war machine's corporate component operated under government supervision, yes, but the former scarcely served to moderate the more totalitarian impulses of the latter. Indeed, in the United States, government intervention in the market was needed to stem the involvement of Western companies, Ford Motor Company and International Business Machines among them, with the German military effort. The tractor manufacturer from Invasion, USA summed up this cognitive ideological dissonance nearly a decade earlier in resisting the Army major's threat to one day commandeer his factory for war production. His protest thereby recognizes the menace of encroaching collectivism not only in the Soviet style of governance, but also, accurately but also somewhat nonsensically, in the Western effort to put a halt to it. Where persuasion and coherent argumentation fail, coercion has a tendency to step in. Take Japan, which has been experiencing political turmoil since Kishi Noboshuki, Imperial Army veteran and war criminal, became prime minister under other than democratic circumstances in 1957. This year sees the forcible suppression of nonviolent socialist resistance in May, when police break up a sit-in protest at the Diet Building. Though the crackdown foils the demonstrators who hope to disrupt a rapprochement between the governments of Japan and the United States, it also undoes Noboshuki's premiership. His strong-arm tactics shock the conscience of many among the Japanese, who are as vigilant against the return of fascism as they are against the rise of any leftist collectivist movement, and he steps down the following month in the face of growing civil unrest. In October, the far right strikes back. A fanatic murders a communist policeman in a harrowing melee on Japanese TV. The incident is unique in the, one presumes, inadvertent use of television to amplify and disseminate the trauma of bearing witness to murder as it happens, or live, as it's long been known in the industry parlance. Though the motion picture media have been vehicles for chronicling true death, at least since newsreels frankly showed the slaughter of the Italian campaign in 1943, the broadcast of death in near real time, as it occurs here, is largely without precedent. Where a fictional TV broadcast can foreclose on one's prospects, as in Eddie's case, in reality it can literally claim one's life. The laser is first beamed in a laboratory in May 1960. Having been a daydream in the hearts of boys and girls since narrative film's earliest technicians scratched a lightning ray on the surface of a negative. The technologies imagined in speculative fiction tend to be only equally, or more often less, dramatic when realized. The atomic bombings that ended World War II, grotesque though they were, differed qualitatively but not quantitatively from their predecessor, the conventional air raid. In the raw tribulation of lost lives, the firebombings of Tokyo and Dresden were commensurate, as history books often note. And after the bloodlettings at Nagasaki and Hiroshima, Ike famously architected a social engineering endeavor, the Atoms for Peace program, to reconfigure atomic power for the benefit of civilian infrastructure. Radar was being redeployed to similar ends, having been installed at civilian airports to help move passengers and commerce. Bombing reconnaissance, a craft greatly advanced in its particulars by World War II's vast air raids, was folded in the peaceful interregnum between the war to end all wars and this one into the civilian practice of aerial land surveying, once used to seek and target the enemy's center of production and their often civilian satellites. Recon sorties were now being flown over the domestic United States. If this seems ominous on one level, on another it's simply an obligation incurred by the sweet kiss of military technology. The massive infusion of labor and funding prompted by the conflict of the milieu de siècle so seduced the American establishment with these new flows of wealth and power that, once forged, this infrastructure had to be maintained. Hence, the technologies generated by the war became boosters of the cause of peace to a war-weary public. The laser is a conspicuous exception. It's said you can go blind from looking directly at it, but aside from that, from its inception, the laser's potential destructive power is slight. This is not what had been predicted. Moving fiction had endlessly anticipated the laser's lethality, from the 1930s serials to the ballistic devastation of the post-war classics, the scissoring precise beams of annihilating light in Earth versus the Flying Saucers and War of the Worlds. What the Hughes Research Lab offers instead is a delicate instrument that might, for instance, facilitate advancements in surgery. And speaking of technology, television is getting more visceral and having more broad-ranging, often unanticipated effects. The moment we cede cultural territory to television, the sinister device jealously conquers it. The Kennedy-Nixon presidential debates in the United States are the first to be widely televised, and the medium immediately sways the polls in the Democrats' favor. Nixon, fidgety, querulous, and cooking under the lights, is no match for the debonair JFK, who commands the television the way most of us can only command our bathroom mirror. Television, and by this I mean particularly the CRT screen, can also be envisioned as a technology for promoting peace, but this is done without compromising any of its power as an instrument for influencing the public. Witness Atomic War Bride, a sci-fi curio from Tito's Yugoslavia. Little noticed in the West, War Bride tells a Cold War narrative starkly at odds with the one presented in the Hollywood saucer films. Yugoslavia provides a particularly useful perspective on the contemporary political situation in Europe, having staked out a careful neutrality in the wrangle between the United States and the Soviet Union. Yugoslavia has no existential reason to prefer either country's political agenda, and so War Bride fails to stake out a position when it comes to the primacy of Western capitalism or the Leninist perspective. So neutral is it that, taking a cue from Orwell, Huxley, and other science fiction writers, it presents not the current world, but an allegorical near future populated with imaginary nations. The one our protagonists hail from has a flag that, aside from a field of white, is completely blank. An evocative move from director Veljko Bulajic. Is this the white flag of surrender, preordaining the nation's eventual defeat? Or is it meant to evoke the concept of nationalism in the abstract without associating it with any particular geopolitical state? War Bride revolves around young John and Maria, who are about as unlike Eddie and his beau as you can imagine. A charming son who dotes on his family, John seeks Maria's hand in marriage, and Maria, likewise a gentle and lovely soul, reciprocates. Alas, their love is just as doomed as the young couples in Beatniks, but again for roughly the opposite reason. Eddie's gang has opted to wage war on a culture that otherwise would grant them stability in exchange for nothing more than Eddie's singing voice. John and Maria, by contrast, have worked hard to do right, but while they have devoted their lives to fulfilling the ethical and traditional obligations of their society, this society has utterly failed them in return. The war's tragic violence robs the couple of their dream when an air attack disrupts their ceremony just before they can exchange vows. John is subsequently conscripted and torn from his would-be bride, and the film spirals downward to ever more hopeless circumstances as the city burns and Maria's feeble cousin Jack crumples under the pressures of boot camp. Their lives are already in ruins before the A-bomb even falls.
Jack, tell him about your heart.
They can't keep me. Don't worry.
Oh, John, speak to the lieutenant, please, John.
All right, Auntie, I swear. Maria, write to me.
Where?
I don't know, Maria.
The war's symbolic aspect is frivolous, and its imaginary aspect abstract, in inverse relationship to the violence of its reality. John and Maria's nation has no name and no flag, and no vision of a better future is offered to justify their fight. When innocents suffer, and suffer they vividly do, a cow is alleged to have been gunned down dead in reality to get a shot. It comes across as doubly tragic for seeming so needless. Unsurprisingly, as the toll mounts in property and lives, the populace's resistance and anger grow. At last, the leader feels the need to bolster public support for the conflict through the use of a publicity stunt. By this time, John and Maria, significantly less idealistic than they were only a few hours before, have been reunited in an air raid shelter where, on a tremendous nearby television screen, the leader announces that the government has decided to launch an atomic missile against the enemy. In a gruesome twist, they have mounted a camera on the nose of the missile to broadcast the final moments before the device detonates in the opposing capital's city center.
We are absolutely certain.
He declares, a bit visibly nervous.
We are absolutely convinced you will hail the choice we have made.
The result, though, is quite the opposite. Horror-struck at the spectacle of panicked civilians fleeing from the projectile or hopelessly cowering, a man shoots out the TV screen with a pistol, and in short order, the refugees in the air raid shelter are in open revolt. The optimistic notion that the spectacle of atomic war would repel its onlookers goes back at least as far as 1914, when H.G. Wells, in his novel The World Set Free, A Story of Mankind, predicted that the atom bomb would create peace on Earth as the human race recoiled from the sight of these weapons, destroying whole cities. Though Hiroshima and Nagasaki had not quite this effect, overall Wells once again demonstrated astonishing powers of foresight. The doomsday device has at least eked out a sort of global stalemate, one particularly demonstrated in neutral Yugoslavia. Belogic's film clearly conveys his contempt for atomic weapons. With the admittedly glaring exception of the Korean conflict, wholesale military conflagrations, as broke out in 1914 and 1937, have been avoided. And perhaps the fact that World War II is commonly thought of as having broken out in 1939 has some relationship to the fact that Korea is commonly excluded when the overall peace of the post-war globe is posited. What Belogic really adds to the mix is this idea of the missile-mounted camera and the feed being broadcast to the refugees in their air raid shelters. In another peculiar fictional echo of the terrible televised assassination of Enejiro Asanuma in Japan, here again is an eerie early instance of true death being broadcast live. Having borne witness to such tragedy twice now, audiences, one real, one imaginary, have responded with protest and revolution. The peace demonstrations that follow Asanuma's death go on for weeks. Would such an innovation deployed in reality have this same effect, one wonders? Or would it have the effect that the leader wanted it to have? Scientists are nowhere near being able to give us the answer. Though weapons-mounted film cameras have been common on fighter airplanes since World War II, the difficulties involved in affixing a live television camera to a long-range missile are prohibitive. Perhaps such technology will be available someday in the future, and we will learn more about this aspect of such important questions regarding human nature. Another film shot in Yugoslavia, though produced in West Germany, is Horrors of Spider Island, Episode 1011, a poorly sublimated work that tracks the fate of a troupe of nightclub dancers after a plane ferrying them to Singapore crashes over the open seas. Spider Island scarcely advertises its European origin and pedigree, however, as its exterior location shots are made to stand in for Hollywood sets and fictionalized Pacific islands. These shots were most likely gathered on Croatia's Adriatic coast, where palm trees and frothing surf can be found in abundance. Yugoslavia is today hosting robust tourism and film industries, again a probable windfall of its Cold War neutrality. It's dislocating, watching a socialist nation's locale stand in for arch-capitalist American shores in a film financed by a nation that was once America's greatest enemy. We're reminded once more of narrative film's capacity for eliding symbolic meanings in favor of surface-level resemblances. When I say Spider Island is poorly sublimated, I don't mean to single it out. Popular culture in the preceding decade was known for its sexual repression, a phenomenon even the artists at Mad Magazine called attention to at the time. And while such repression reduces overt discussion of the carnal act, it also increases the frequency with which this act is referenced obliquely. Russ Meyer's The Immortal Mr. Tease, released the previous year, likely just as Spider Island was being shot, was among the first movies to frankly portray nudity on the screen for its own sake, but otherwise the only films to cross this boundary were those documenting nudist colonies or native tribes that had not yet made proper contact with the West. These movies are about sex as much as Mr. Tease is, but their creators made a goal of never mentioning it overtly, lest they run into trouble with government or religious censors. Sexualizing the splitting of the atom might not have seemed far-fetched to contemporaneous moviegoers. In 1946, after all, two French fashion designers coined the term bikini after having the good luck to showcase a skimpy new swimsuit design for women mere days after the first post-war hydrogen bomb tests on the Bikini Atoll in the South Pacific. In one of those strange attractors so common in popular culture, the pair came up with their innovation wholly independently. Jacques Heim, a shop owner in the resort of Cannes, marketed a two-piece bikini of his own design under the name L'Atome, it being, like its namesake, the smallest particle of its type in the known world. 3 weeks later, design Louis Réard released a similar garment, formerly dubbed the Bikini, because, evidently, of his prediction that its effect on the fashion world would be as explosive as the recent tests in the Pacific. This proved true, and the bikini, though popular, was too shocking to garner wide acceptance in the United States until this year, coinciding with the release of the spring break teen comedy Where the Boys Are. The Bikini's promoters have two events to thank for their change of fortune: the granting of statehood to the Pacific island of Hawaii in 1959, which sparked a gleeful enthusiasm in the States for everything having to do with the beach, and the probably not unrelated recent release of Gidget. Both Gidget and Boys feature slightly more modest versions of the bikinis worn on the libertine French shores, and the incorrigible innocence of their leading ladies diffused much of these films' otherwise threatening sexuality. Spider Island is a sleazy variation on this formula, as the castaway ladies and their mesomorphic hypermasculine guardian Gary gad about in skimpy beachwear in a way that is not at all sexual. No chance. Their focus, at least in the movie's first half, is simply to find the food, water, and shelter needed to survive. Once that's procured, they manage to scramble far enough up Maslow's hierarchy of needs to worry about getting rescued before they start getting picked off one by one and backslide down to survival again. There are no romantic connections between characters. An abortive liaison between Barry and Georgia, the ringleader of the dancing troupe, is more of an exception that proves the rule. The film is nevertheless clearly meant to titillate, to stimulate the viewer's prurient interest. So far, so good. Spider Island's most interesting move is to fuse this sexualized aesthetic with that of the atomic age sci-fi B-movie, and though it does this clumsily, it manages to make its point. One suspects screenwriter Fritz Bottiger worked backward from the name, Horrors of Spider Island, to forge the movie's concept. A discus-sized radioactive arachnid bites Gary, who promptly morphs the Fly style into a half-man, half-monster. This transformation deranges his mind in the usual fashion, and he starts skulking around, murdering the women he'd been charged with protecting. The radiation that's to blame for this calamity was introduced to the island by a team of plunderers masquerading as scientists, who left an atomic hammer there on a previous expedition. The moral here, that the Atoms for Peace program, however well-intentioned, has just as much potential as the nuclear arms race to lead to harm, is one you might expect from a West Germany still only a few years removed from the war. They had narrowly avoided being targeted for atomic weapons themselves. The Manhattan Project had been forged with the Nazis more in mind than the Japanese. More interesting is the decision to set the movie in the vast Pacific, as simulated by Croatia's Adriatic coast. Home of the A-bomb tests and Ivy Mike, these waters also hosted the original Bikini Atoll detonations, the ones to be so immediately and bizarrely sexualized by Haim and Rayard and the beachwear fad they separately created. The Bikini's namesake was quickly forgotten, and by 1960 few even remember the origin of the word. Perhaps Fritz Bertger is unwitting when he recouples the sexuality and morbidity of the Bikini origin tale, but he does it nonetheless. The bikini as a cultural artifact has been spun off from an event that has brought pollution, mutation, and death. And where in happy-go-lucky tripe like where the boys are, these origins are completely erased. In the horrors of Spider Island, they coexist uneasily. Such is the difference between the happy Florida coast and the dark waters of the Pacific, the ruins of Marshall Plan Germany, the Yugoslavian woods.
Please don't cry, Maria. Please, please, Maria, please, for my sake.
The world has changed. Everything's so horrible. I'm doubting we might die.
No, my sweet. We're in love. It's impossible to die.